Los Angeles, 1925. Philip Marlowe was 22 years old and still wore the navy blue uniform of the lapped with a pride that would soon crack. Son of an Irish labourer who died in a construction accident when Philip was only 16, he had joined the police with the naive idea that he could make a difference, clean up the streets, protect the innocent. His mother, a seamstress with fingers worn by needles, had watched him leave that morning with that gleam of hope mixed with worry that mothers carry when their sons embrace dangerous causes. The Bunker Hill neighborhood was still respectable then. Its Victorian houses had not yet given way to towers of glass and steel. It was there that everything changed for Marlowe, in one of those turreted mansions where Eleanor Castleton lived, widow of an oil magnate, a 60-year-old woman with silver hair and eyes of a blue faded by tears. The case had begun simply, repeated burglaries at Mrs. Castleton's house. Nothing very valuable disappeared, a few jewels of little worth, some cash, sometimes just food. Sergeant Murphy, an Irishman with red jowls who perpetually smelled of whiskey, had assigned the investigation to Marlowe with a blasé shrug. Probably kids from the neighborhood. Make the rounds, write a report, and we'll file it away. But Philip Marlowe was not Murphy. He had knocked on Eleanor Castleton's door on a November afternoon when fog rose from the Pacific like a grey shroud. The old lady had welcomed him with Earl Grey tea and dry cookies, in a living room that smelled of lavender and loneliness. She had spoken to him of her husband, dead 3 years earlier, of this house too large for her alone, of those nocturnal sounds that woke her with a start. "I'm not lying to you, Officer Marlowe," she had said in her trembling voice. "There's someone in this house at night. Someone who knows the place." Philip had first thought of an elderly woman's hallucinations, of the ghosts that solitude creates. Then he had noticed the details, the lock on the service door that bore traces of skillfully masked break-ins, the footprints in the basement dust, too small to be those of an adult man. The investigation had led him to Tommy Castellanos, 13 years old, son of a Mexican family driven from their home by a crooked downtown landlord. The kid had been living on the streets with his little sister Maria, 8 years old, since their mother died of tuberculosis and their father disappeared, probably forced back to Mexico by the authorities. Tommy broke into Mrs. Castleton's house not out of vice, but out of necessity. He took just enough to survive, he and his sister. Philip had found them huddled in an abandoned shed in Boyle Heights, 2 children with eyes too large in gaunt faces. Tommy had looked at him with that fierce pride of the poor who refuse pity, ready to fight to the end. Maria clutched a frayed rag doll, the only vestige of their former life. "You gonna arrest us?" Tommy had asked in Spanish, then in broken English. Philip had looked at these 2 children surviving in a city that didn't want them, in a country that considered them intruders. He had thought of the law, of his duty, of his oath. Then he had thought of his own childhood after his father's death, of the nights when his mother sewed until dawn to pay the rent, of the hunger that gnawed at his stomach when money was short. "No," he had answered. "I'm not going to arrest you." Instead, Philip Marlowe had done something that would change the course of his life. He had returned to see Eleanor Castleton and told her the truth. The whole truth. He expected anger, demands for immediate arrest. Instead, the old lady had wept. Those poor children. My God, in my own city. 3 days later, Tommy and Maria Castellanos moved into the former servants' room of the Castleton house. Eleanor had found in them the family she had never had, and they had found in her the grandmother that life had denied them. Philip had written a report mentioning that the burglaries had ceased, without specifying the exact circumstances. But Murphy was not fooled. And Murphy had connections with Amos Buchanan, a real estate developer who had long coveted the Castleton property to build cheap apartments. Buchanan needed the old lady gone, one way or another. "You screwed up, boy," Murphy had told Philip in the station locker room. "Buchanan wants that house. He promised me $500 if I could get the old woman to leave. You just complicated things. Justice isn't for sale, Sergeant." Murphy had laughed, a fat and cynical laugh. "Justice? You still believe that crap? This city belongs to those who can afford to pay for it. You'd better learn that fast." Philip had discovered the extent of the corruption a few weeks later. Murphy and a dozen other cops were on Buchanan's payroll. The developer didn't just bribe, he intimidated, threatened, And when that wasn't enough, he acted. Eleanor Castleton had received anonymous letters, her windows had been broken, someone had poisoned her cat. Young Philip Marlowe found himself facing a dilemma that would haunt him all his life: respect the law as it was written, or respect justice as he felt it. He had chosen justice. One December night, he had waited in the shadows for Buchanan's thugs to come, convinced Mrs. Castleton. There were 3 of them, armed with iron bars and bad intentions. Philip had welcomed them with his Colt .38 and determination forged in cold anger. "You're on private property, gentlemen. I suggest you leave." The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes. 2 of the men had fled, the third lay unconscious in Eleanor's rose bushes. Philip hadn't called for backup. He had dragged the man to the street and left him there, with a message for Buchanan scrawled on a piece of paper: "Next time, I'll have less restraint." Murphy had summoned him the next morning. In his office that smelled of rancid sweat and failed ambitions, he had looked at Philip with a mixture of anger and something that almost resembled respect. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, boy. Buchanan wants your hide. And I can't protect you anymore. I never asked for your protection, Sergeant." "No, but you're going to need it. They're going to frame you for assault. Or they're going to set you up. Or maybe they'll just take care of you in a dark alley." Philip had resigned from the police that very day. Not out of fear, but out of disgust. He had understood that the uniform he wore with such pride was just a costume in a masquerade where the real criminals had respectable fronts and where justice was negotiated to the highest bidder. 3 months later, Philip Marlowe opened his private detective office in a small shabby office on 6th Street. His first client was Eleanor Castleton, who wanted him to discreetly watch the comings and goings around her property. His second was the wife of a worker who suspected her husband of cheating. His third was a businessman who needed to recover stolen documents. Philip had discovered his calling in that grey zone between law and justice, where a man alone with his principles could still make a difference. He had learned that morality was not a matter of rules written in dusty books, but an inner compass that pointed north even when everyone around you claimed it was south. Years later, when people would ask him why he did this thankless job, Philip Marlowe would think back to Tommy and Maria Costillanos, to Eleanor Castleton, to that December night when he had chosen his side. He would think of Murphy and Buchanan, of all those men who thought everything had a price. He would think above all of that fundamental lesson learned at 22, in a world where justice was for sale, an honest man had no choice but to become an outlaw to remain honest.